On 666 Mornings, Alex Sloan with you, and very nice to have your company. The phone number is 1300 681 666 and the SMS number is 0467 922 666. It's 4 degrees, as you've heard, in town. And I've had a few calls during the week following the devastating program that went to air on Four Corners on Monday night. In the program, which was produced by Channel 4 in Britain, Monday's program forensically investigated allegations that up to 40,000 Tamil civilians were killed as Sri Lankan government forces moved in to destroy the Tamil Tiger Army. The program produced evidence that while the Tigers used civilians as human shields, the government forces repeatedly shelled civilians who had been offered sanctuary in no-fire zones. The Sri Lankan government denies this and questions the numbers killed and the authenticity of the visual evidence. Featured in the program is my next guest, Gordon Weiss, who served as a UN spokesperson in Sri Lanka between 2007 and 2010. He has returned to Australia and has written the book called The Cage, The Fight for Sri Lanka and the Last Days of the Tamil Tigers. And Gordon Weiss joins me in the studio. Thank you very much for coming in.
Alex, thank you for having me.
You appeared in the Channel 4 program. Now, as I said, the Sri Lankan government questions the authenticity of the footage and the allegation that up to 40,000 Tamil civilians were killed.
Yes, well, this is a stock standard response, and in the words of the former High Commissioner for Human Rights, this is what people who are accused of wrongdoing do. Of course they don't accept it or acknowledge it, and they will continue to deny it, and I'm sure we will see that in the future. Mm.
The program began with the decision by the UN to leave. Why did the UN leave?
They left because they were coming under aerial bombardment. We had 7 or 8 staff there who were terrified. They were really frightened for their lives. They were, rather than delivering humanitarian aid, which was their primary role there, they were actually sheltering in bunkers from the aerial bombardment. And those bombs were exploding as close as 300 metres away and certainly peppering the UN buildings with shrapnel. Of course, it was much worse for civilians who were outside and who were trying to escape the bombing. But eventually it was decided that they could no longer really perform their functions there, and the government had made it very clear that the UN should remove its staff from the fire zone because they would no longer guarantee the safety of UN staff, so we eventually withdrew them.
How much is that a standout when the government says it will not, ensure the safety of UN staff? When have we seen that before?
Well, I think there are obvious parallels with Bosnia. I must say that the two situations are somewhat different in the sense that the UN had been given a very slight role in Sri Lanka for a very long time. It had been intentionally denied a greater role than just delivering humanitarian aid. It didn't have a political role. It didn't really have observers on the ground. So it was humanitarian staff who were trying to deal with a very complicated political and military situation.
Because that scene in the show, the program that at Four Corners aired, with the people putting their hands through, going, "We know what's going to happen when you leave."
Yes, I mean there was a strong sense from people that the UN and other international staff provided some measure of protection against what they knew was coming. I mean, this final phase of the war had been going on for a couple of years by that stage, and steadily the government of Sri Lanka had been pushing the Tamil Tiger lines back and back and back and clearing villages as they went. So the end game was, I think, obvious.
Gordon Weiss is with me, and I'm talking about. We're going to get into talking about his book, The Cage. To put this recent history in context, which is what you do in the book, since independence in 1948, you write that this beautiful land, Sri Lanka, has been marred by a toxic mix of religion, nationalism, and xenophobia.
Yes, I mean, Sri Lanka in 1948 was poised to do really well. It was, it had a great reputation. Its finances were in great order. It had been left this wonderful infrastructure by the British who left in 1948. But unfortunately, they took a turn that I think everybody pretty much regrets, and that was that in 1956. As a domestic political move, really a rather cynical grab for power, Felix Bandaranaike pitched the notion that there should be Sinhalese should be the national tongue that was used in Sri Lanka. Now, that immediately offsided the other very important community in Sri Lanka, which was the Tamils. And effectively, when that legislation was passed in 1956, the Sinhala-only Act, Tamils suddenly, who had lived on the island for thousands of years, felt that they had been sidelined, diminished, degraded, and they could no longer do very practical things like get jobs in the judiciary or in the police force, or university was being
because of language.
Yeah, because of language. Yeah. Official documents were being issued in a tongue that they couldn't read or understand. So it was a blow.
They were formed in 1983, the Tamil Tigers, and you write, over 3 decades, this vicious group assassinated world leaders, used female suicide bombers and child soldiers.
Yeah, they were actually formed in about the early 1970s, the Tigers, but they remained just a rabble, really. Engaging in bank robberies and occasional killings, and really internecine warfare between various Tamil groups up until about 1983. But in 1983, there were large-scale communal riots in Colombo and throughout the rest of Sri Lanka, and somewhere between 1,000 and 3,000 Tamils were killed. And this really brought on a rush of conscripts to the Tamil Tigers. It also resulted in India training up these Tamil groups. So India provided succour to the Tamil groups, provided military camps, and thousands of Tamil youths flocked to these groups to join them to fight the state.
Explain that a bit more for us, India's involvement.
Well, India's, of course, Sri Lanka's largest neighbour to the north. There had been a very close relationship between the former administration in Sri Lanka and the government of Indira Gandhi. When J.R. Jayawardena was voted into office, he wasn't liked particularly by Mrs. Gandhi at all, and she frankly made trouble for him. That combined with the complex politics of Tamil Nadu, one of the largest and most important states in southern India, which had always had a separatist element in its domestic politics. So India also had an interest in trying to see that the Tamil problem was settled in northern Sri Lanka in a way that would not provide a locus for separation in India. So the politics between India and Sri Lanka were always complex, always shifting, and they remained that way. But very significant. Yeah. Absolutely.
You write that they almost succeeded in carving out a Tamil nation state in the north of Sri Lanka.
Well, they became this rather astonishing organisation, the Tamil Tigers. The Tamil diaspora, largely created by those riots in 1983, also became a tremendous powerhouse of funding for this very violent group that began to battle the state, and it began to battle it on multiple fronts. They used terrorist tactics. They were also a very fine guerrilla outfit. They eventually developed the ability to take on the army of Sri Lanka in fixed battles. I mean, really fighting like two armies. Towards the latter part, they developed undersea vehicles, light aircraft, which carried out air raids on Colombo. They practiced bombing campaigns in throughout Sri Lanka as well, and they really perfected, I suppose, the tactics of suicide warfare that they had learned in the Middle East. They brought it back and refined it.
So essentially, they were terrorists.
No, they were an insurgent group that that used terrorist tactics, and there is no question about it. They were a frightful bunch, and they committed numerous outrages, and they targeted civilians. It was the perversion of a revolution. I mean, they did become a perversion. In fact, a book which has just been published by a friend of mine called Tamil Tigress tells this very story, the story of a young girl who joins this insurgent group and then leaves because she's so horrified by the violence that was practiced by the Tamil Tigers.
Was there any room for negotiation here?
There was at various times, but I think that what happened with the Tamil Tigers ultimately was it became very caught up with the personality of the leader, Prabhakaran himself, and I think Prabhakaran was a pretty unsavoury guy. He was possibly a psychopath. I mean, he was someone who had a long history of being drawn to violence. He was an extremely violent character. The Sri Lankan state set out to match violence with violence. And the issue is not that they took on the Tamil Tigers, as I have said many times before, but the way in which they fought the war to the end. And it's really this final episode of the war in which the greatest number of civilians were killed. And I argue that they were killed needlessly.
Many would argue that the government's destruction of the Tamil Tigers was justified. What do you say when people say that?
I think that's true. I think that it was justified. I think that the Tamil Tigers were a group that became whose original purpose became perverted by its own violence. They did almost bring the state to their knees. I think the government was justified in regaining its sovereign territory. It had a duty to all its citizens to do that. That was not really the issue, and it's certainly not why I wrote the book. I wrote the book to show what happened in the final months, and my central argument is that the army of Sri Lanka, unfortunately, was directed to go too far and to make, I think, erroneous decisions.